All of Victoria is now above 80%, and all of New South Wales, apart from one LGA, is now also above that 80% vaccination rate. So only the Byron Bay LGA remains below that 80%. They're only just below that 80%. We hope they can get to that 80%, but we know that this has caused enormous frustration for people who haven't been sure regarding whether they can come in from next Tuesday or not. The good news is that's all been clarified now, and as of next Tuesday, we are good to go. Those borders will come up and people will be able to come into South Australia. Now, we are expecting a very significant increase in the amount of testing which we envisage will need to be done in South Australia. So I'm also announcing today that we are expanding the times that two of our primary sites will be operating. That's the Victoria Park testing centre and also the Ridgehaven testing centre. These will move from Tuesday next week to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're putting on an additional 100 personnel across SA Pathology from Tuesday next week, and we'll be making sure that we have the requisite staff in place to make sure that we can keep that testing regime up as we lift the borders to the rest of the country. Now, with regards to the technology, a lot of people have been asking about entry check. That goes live as of 5 o'clock this afternoon. So as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, people will be able to go online, they'll be able to fill out their details, and they'll get that confirmation of what category they are in. They'll get that almost instantaneously with information back to them about what restrictions may be in place. Now, we are asking everybody that is coming from essentially every jurisdiction in Australia now to be double vaccinated. But we're also asking those people that are coming in from areas like New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT to have a test 72 hours before they come into South Australia. Now, they don't need to get the result, but they do need to have that test done. This is another layer of protection for South Australia. And for those jurisdictions that are between 80% and 90%, we're asking them to also have a test on arrival. They don't need to isolate before they get that test result, but what we're doing is opening the borders, but doing it in a way that is safe for South Australians. We are the first jurisdiction in the entire country that is COVID-free, that is lifting our borders. Now, there is some risk associated with this, and that's why we're putting these speed humps in the way of the disease taking hold in South Australia. We're doing that because we want to see those vaccination rates climb even higher, and as we've stated before, we're very keen to get that to 90% as quickly as possible. That offers the ultimate protection for our state. Now, there are thousands and thousands of vaccination appointments which are available today. So my strong message to all South Australians is that the border is opening on Tuesday next week. The best thing that you can do for yourself, for your family, for your workplace, for your entire state is to go and have that vaccination. It's safe, it's effective, it's very quick, convenient, and it will protect our entire state. We also, next week, will be on the 23rd, we'll have VaxCheck available. Now, VaxCheck is when you use your QR code check-in, you will also be able to demonstrate your vaccination status. That will go live as of next week, and so will Health Check. And you may be required to monitor your health when you come into South Australia. This will all be contained within the information that comes back to you after you complete your entry check. So entry check goes live as of 5 o'clock this afternoon. The borders come up on Tuesday next week, and we're looking forward to welcoming people back into South Australia who've been excluded for such a long time.
So for most people, they'll be having to get tested twice within 72 or slightly.
Some people definitely will need to. So at the moment, of course, they're required to do 14 days of quarantine here in South Australia, and this precludes a lot of people from coming into South Australia. Going forward, if you're in an LGA that's between 80 and 90%, you'll need to do a test before you go and when you arrive. If you're above 90%, which is of course now a large proportion of the country, then you will only need to do the test within 72 hours of travel to South Australia. We're going to do everything we can to keep South Australia safe, but we are opening up those borders, so it's inevitable that there will be cases coming into South Australia. We want to minimise the risk of this disease taking hold in our state.
Unvaccinated people, if they're coming from, is that just New South Wales and Victoria that they need to apply for an exemption, or is that all states?
All states now will need to be using the entry check. So we want to find out the information from everybody. At the moment, we are allowing people to come in from some states without any vaccination whatsoever. That stops as of Tuesday next week. It's one rule right across the country. If you want to come to South Australia, you need to be fully vaccinated. And that also goes, of course, for South Australians leaving our state wanting to come back in. They need to be fully vaccinated.
If a South Australian leaves the state and then wants to come back in, do they have to apply for an exemption? Is that what it is?
Everybody coming in will need to do entry check, and that will give them the information, because we'll be able to work out how long they've been away, where they have been, what their vaccination status is, and then we'll be able to provide them with information regarding what they need to do in terms of testing and potentially isolation going forward. Now, of course, there is still an exemptions process. So if people do need to come in and maybe they haven't been vaccinated, we still will be able to process that, for example, on a compassionate basis like we do at the moment. But we expect the numbers making that exemption application to plummet because, of course, on Tuesday we open up to the rest of the country.
If an unvaccinated resident of South Australia travels into state, does that enable them to get an exemption to return home?
Well, they'd have to make that application, but they would have to go into a form of quarantine, yes. So it is a very important point for South Australians to understand. Obviously, we are messaging very strongly at the moment that we want South Australians to get vaccinated. If they leave South Australia and they go into a place which has got community transmission, they're a risk coming back. And that is why we need to make it very clear South Australians travelling across the border will need to fill out that entry check form, and they will need to do quarantine if they are not vaccinated.
Can I just ask you on quarantine? It says here that quarantine for international and high-risk settings, it's quarantine for 7 days using Health Check SA. Does that mean that they can quarantine at home and they don't have to go into medi-hotels?
Well, it's done on an individual basis, Andrew. So, for example, if somebody is saying, look, I want to quarantine at home living with my 6 mates, the answer is no, you'll have to go into a medi-hotel. But if people can find genuine places of isolation for that quarantine program, then they can do that at home. And that's been pioneered here in South Australia using the app that we developed here in our state, trialled it in our state, now rolled out across New South Wales and Victoria. So everybody should be very proud of the work that the digital team has done here in our state.
So just to clarify, it's home quarantine unless it's deemed unsuitable by SA Health.
Correct.
Then it's a medi-hotel.
Correct. And I would also say that as of Tuesday next week, we move from 14 days requirement for quarantine for those people coming in from overseas down to 7. Now, I'm hopeful that in the future we'll be able to remove that completely. That's certainly our intention. But we do move from 14 days down to 7 as of next Tuesday. So again, we're the first of the COVID-safe states to be able to offer that reduction in that quarantine.
Will the app work out these low, moderate risks? Will that work out those areas, or do people have to go into
No, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for people with this app. So they'll put their detail in and they'll get that information back almost instantly, so they'll know what they need to do in terms of testing. They'll know what they need to do in terms of isolation if that's required.
Just one more on high risk settings. Does the ashes count as a high risk setting?
I might ask Emily to answer that in a moment, but I think it's mainly to do with aged care settings and of course our hospitals.
And it does mean at this stage that Sydney and Melbourne, given that they're under that 80% vaccination rate, people won't be able to be coming in from those major cities.
No, I've just addressed that. So we had a situation with an anomaly with the statistics, because there were some LGAs like Sydney, like Melbourne, like Randwick, I think, where they had a high student population which was included in that denominator. All of that has been worked through now. So there is only one LGA in New South Wales, which is the Byron Bay LGA. All others, people can come in, and I know this will be a huge relief for people in Sydney and in Melbourne who have been anxious about whether this anomaly in the statistics could be reconciled. It has. The borders are going up next week. There will be no requirement for quarantine for fully vaccinated people coming in from Sydney and Melbourne.
And what are the actual percentages at the moment, Premier, for the Sydney and Melbourne? Do you know what it's above 80%, but do we have an actual precise figure?
All available online. I don't have it all in my head, but I know there's only the one which is Byron Bay, which is below 80, which I think is sitting at about 78, 79. So they could get there by next Tuesday. which would be great. But all the others are somewhere between 80 and 100. Some of them got very, very high vaccination rates. So there won't be a requirement for testing when people come in from those LGAs that have got above 90%. And that's why we've got this check-in app, which will make it very simple for people. They'll put their stats, their information into the app, and then they'll get their requirement for testing and also potentially isolation from that almost immediate email that will go to them.
Have you seen the modelling on the 90% from the Adelaide University model?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
So I think we're doing further modelling on what happens at 90%.
Well, no, so the model has been built, and of course at the moment it's a theoretical model, but all the time we're putting in real data, and so as we get closer to when we get to 90%, that will give us a much better picture of the type of public health social measures that we need to have in place, and also the test, trace, isolate and quarantine regime that we need to have in place, but that hasn't been received yet.
Maybe West and South Australians get their vaccination certificate onto their phone
Tuesday. Yep,
Tuesday.
goes live Tuesday.
Premier,
Vax check.
You've ruled out a mandate to make it mandatory for vaccinations across the board. Yet for people coming into South Australia, they have to be double vaccinated.
Correct.
Why are you ruling out the mandate across the board if we're doing
Look,
piecemeal type?
I understand the question. Look, the reality is, if we made it mandatory for every single person to be vaccinated in South Australia, then tens of thousands of people would lose their jobs virtually overnight. Now, in some instances, there are perfectly logical and reasonable reasons why people can't become vaccinated, and we want to leave that option open. But our strong message to everybody is you're doing yourself a favour if you can actually get vaccinated. It's going to protect yourself and your family, your workplace and the entire state, and the sooner we get to 90%, the sooner we get some further reductions in restrictions in our state.
What happens now with Vicky Chapman after the vote?
Well, we are just getting on with keeping South Australia safe and making sure that we can continue to grow our economy. That's what we've been doing the entire time. I know the Labor Party want to play political games. This is their number one issue. My number one issue is keeping South Australia safe and growing our economy and opening those borders on Tuesday next week.
Did you in fact ask Vicky Chapman for her resignation?
Sorry?
Did you in fact ask Vicky Chapman for her resignation?
Absolutely not.
Will you be stepping in, putting a party and asking her to?
Absolutely not. Look, I've made myself extraordinarily clear on the issue of Vicky Chapman for weeks and weeks and weeks. She enjoys my 100% support.
Do you
But the
think she
governor's now
enjoys
been
the
called in.
percent?
Is that appropriate
The-
that the governor be called in?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, but the reality is the governor takes advice from Executive Council and from me as the Premier, and I will not be issuing any advice to remove Vicky Chapman. She does an outstanding job for South Australia. She enjoys my 100% support.
Does she enjoy the support of the party, right?
If you're not going to say to remove her, what advice are you going to give to the
Well, I speak to the governor on a very regular basis. I'm certainly not providing any advice with regards to Vicky Chapman. I'm obviously speaking to her on a regular basis about what we're doing to open the borders in South Australia to safely reunite families and provide opportunities for business and commerce and investment in South Australia. Her Excellency does an outstanding job. Of course, she was a former very high-ranking diplomat. She's adding greatly to our consideration of many strategic issues. Vicky Chapman is not one of them.
Given you've made it very clear on a number of occasions Vicky Chapman had your 100% support, and given the way the vote went in Parliament yesterday, a vote of no confidence in the Deputy Premier, could that also be seen as a vote of no confidence in you and your government?
No, I don't think so.
Premier, how can our Parliament continue to operate if someone can be found to mislead the House and remain in Parliament?
Well, you need to ask Peter Malinauskas that. 3 times he defended Ian Hunter and voted against removing him. He had a successful no confidence motion in him 3 times. I mean, you couldn't script this hypocrisy from Peter Malinauskas. 3 times Ian Hunter had a successful no confidence motion, a clear-cut no confidence motion against him. Peter Malinauskas defended him and he voted to keep him in the Parliament.
Lower house is where government is formed. You no longer have the numbers there, and Vicky Chapman, your deputy, has been found to have misled the Parliament on at least 3 occasions. How can South Australians have confidence that our government can run appropriately if someone can be found to mislead the House and
Well,
their job?
I'll just make the point, we continue to pass legislation yesterday. We're getting on with what's important to the people of South Australia. opening up our borders, keeping our economy moving in the right direction and keeping South Australians safe. That's what I'm focused on. I'll leave the Labor Party, some members of the crossbenchers that want to play political games. I don't think anybody in South Australia cares about that one iota. What they want is our economy to continue to move ahead. We've got more people employed in South Australia than ever before in the history of South Australia. That's my job, keeping employment high and making sure that we can keep our state safe.
It's not going away. It's likely now your deputy will be suspended from the lower house and you'll lose.
Well, I'm not, that's your analysis of it, certainly not mine.
Premier, you say that the Labor Party are playing political games, but isn't it your government that tried to shut down the Parliament yesterday and then lost? So aren't you guilty of your party playing political games as well? Not
in the slightest, Andrew. Look, the reality is our sitting program always ended yesterday. There is an optional sitting week which we're now sitting. So, we've sat more days this year than Labor did in their final year before going to the election. And always, when you rise, you put a date after the next election. This is absolutely commonplace. And I just encourage you all to go and take a look at the sitting program in the lead up to the last election. It's almost identical.
Would you have been happy to rise last night for the last time with Christmas penalty rates still up in the air, with the Emergency Management Act still up in the air?
Well, on those two issues, we've made our position on it clear.
But it's not past Parliament.
We're not seeking to change it. There are others that are seeking to change it. Our position on this has been crystal clear since day one. And with regards to the emergency management legislation that you referred to, we've also said that we're not going to be pursuing that legislation. We do not need to. We did put that in place in the early days of the pandemic. It was important to put it there because we weren't sure how it was going to roll out and whether we needed to have special powers in place. We've virtually not used these at all, and we just don't need them to be in place going forward.
So you don't think Vicki Chapman will be suspended?
No.
You're confident you've got the numbers on?
Well, look, I'm not going to speculate on what's going to happen in the Parliament. I am focused on keeping South Australia safe, opening those borders and growing our economy.
But South Australia good of the party
No.
going forward on the eve of the election?
No.
What about, so she has your support, but does she have the support of the party?
Yes.
Has your
The
standard
whole
on...
party room?
Look, my focus today is on health. Your focus is on the political shenanigans of Parliament. I think the people of South Australia want to see South Australia do well. They want to see those borders. They want to see those borders open. They want jobs for their family, and that's what we're
Has
delivering.
your benchmark on ministerial accountability changed since Stefan Knoll resigned?
Not.
Why did he have to resign and Vicki Chapman doesn't?
Well, there's a completely different set of circumstances, and that was a resignation that he made. I'm not going to put.
It's up to the minister.
I'm not going to put. Well, people make decisions for a whole range of reasons. Some of them family related, some of them personal related, but there is, and some of them because they need to because of actions. In this instance, none of those things are present. None of them whatsoever. Well, the Ombudsman is doing an inquiry. This was a referral from the committee. Let the Ombudsman make a decision. People say that there was a result from a committee that had been established. Well, look, the reality was it wasn't clear cut. It wasn't unanimous. There was a dissenting statement which was filed at exactly the same time. I do not think this is clear cut, and the Ombudsman's now looking at it.
If the Ombudsman makes an adverse finding, if the Ombudsman makes an adverse
Sorry,
finding against
Stacey,
Vicki
you
Chapman,
just.
if the Ombudsman makes
Sorry,
an adverse finding
Joel,
against Vicki Chapman,
Joel.
will you force her to stand down? Premier, I'm asking you a question and no one else
I'm
is.
sorry, but
I want you to answer the
I'd already
question.
asked Joel.
If the Ombudsman
Joel,
makes
you
an
can ask your
adverse
question.
finding, if the Ombudsman makes an adverse finding,
I will
against
definitely
Vicki
not answering this
Chapman,
anyway,
what
sorry.
happens? So now you're not
Why did
answering
he
the
leave the
question.
House after the vote?
Don't want to
How
answer
did you
the
feel
question.
after?
No, that's a good question. So Joel asked, and we'll go to Stacey in a second. But Joel asked the question: why did we leave immediately after the vote? And I saw this on television last night. I thought it was curious. I don't think in my time in the Parliament after question time, I've never stayed, or I don't think I'd ever not left the chamber. I mean, it's just common practice. The grieve session is not one that the entire chamber stays in at the same time. So yesterday, normally we have question time for an hour and a quarter. Yesterday that was replaced with the no confidence motion. So immediately that vote was concluded, we left. That is common practice. It has occurred virtually every single day I've been in the Parliament. Stacey.
If the Ombudsman makes an adverse finding against Vicki Chapman, will you ask her?
Well, look, it's a very hypothetical question. Let's see what comes from the investigation and what recommendations are made. But if we need to take action, well, of course we will. but I just don't think that will be the case.
You expect the Ombudsman to investigate
Andrew.
you?
In hindsight,
Yes.
You've had a COVID press conference, taken over by what you describe as political shenanigans. It's quite a serious issue. If you go back and have a look, do you actually regret the fact of how this has transpired and the fact that Vicky Chapman didn't, or anyone around her, didn't advise her to recuse herself and have the decision taken by someone else?
No, look, I've made 1,000 comments on this in the last couple of weeks, and I stand by every single one of them.
Do you
Tom.
expect the Ombudsman to investigate you in your role? It was mentioned.
Well, the Ombudsman can investigate whatever the Ombudsman wishes to investigate. We certainly wouldn't be directing that, but he has been asked by that committee to take a look at this issue, and he will make a decision on the scope of that investigation.
On a separate matter,
Yes.
John Paul Drake,
Yes.
the leader of Drake Supermarkets, announced today that Drake Supermarkets will not be enforcing a vaccine mandate for its employees. This is one of the biggest employers, or a massive employer in South Australia. Business wants leadership from the government on this. Will you, I guess, essentially implement a vaccine?
It's hard to make, it's hard to concentrate on your question.
It is. Will the government be introducing vaccine mandates?
No. All right, thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Bad look for the government on the eve of an election. Are you worried about your chances of re-election with this hanging over?
No, look, honestly, the reality is the people of South Australia care about keeping our state safe. They care about jobs. I was out last night at a school graduation. Not one person asked about what's going on in the state parliament. They're concerned about their lives, their jobs, their future. They're all looking very bright in South Australia. Yes, we've got a couple of tough weeks ahead in terms of opening those borders in South Australia. We're all going to have to be very careful about what is coming our way, more careful than we've been in the past. And that's why my strong message to every single South Australian is go and get vaccinated. If you're not fully vaccinated now, you're opening yourself up to an unnecessary risk. Because when we go into state and we look at those statistics in terms of those people that are contracting the disease, becoming hospitalised, being admitted into ICU or being put onto a ventilator, they are by and large people who are unvaccinated. So go and get vaccinated.
How did Ms. Chapman feel?
Situation, the Emergency Act giving powers to the Police Commissioner and Chief Public Health Officer. Do you envisage those roles, you've spoken about a lot over the last year, and when those roles move on, is 90% the trigger for that?
Well, it's yet to be determined because so we've got the Emergency Management Act in South Australia. That appoints a state coordinator during a major emergency declaration. They're usually things like fires or floods. They're not usually a pandemic. We need to look at that legislation, but we made a decision as a government we'll look at after rather than during. As part of that Emergency Management Act, though, at a pivot point, we moved to recovery, so it moves from the state coordinator to the Chief Executive Department of Premier and Cabinet. So that's what happens in every single major emergency declaration. And yes, there will be a point where we need to make that pivot. No, I wouldn't say that it is, because there's also border restrictions, and we need to know what the feds are doing with the international borders and our state borders. So it's a little bit more complicated than a normal situation, but we are looking at it at the moment.
Premier, how did this...
No, absolutely not. No.
Premier, how did Ms. Chapman...
Well, I speak to the Governor on a very regular basis. In fact, she chaired Executive Council yesterday. So, look, the reality is the Governor can seek my advice at any point in time, and she's not sought my advice on this.
And how did Ms. Chapman feel about the situation? Have you spoken to her?
Well, I speak to her on a very regular basis. We've sat next to each other in the chamber for 9 years in a row. So, look, obviously she would be far happier to be concentrating on her important portfolios than the shenanigans of the South Australian Parliament, but we're in the hands of the Parliament. It doesn't move us off our course. We are doing everything we can to keep South Australia on track, to open the borders on Tuesday next week, to keep people safe and to grow our economy.
Premier, are we ready on Tuesday
Yep.
for this?
We are good to go on Tuesday next week. We've made all the necessary precautions. We now need South Australians to continue to get vaccinated as we head towards the end of the year. Thank you.
Does the ashes count as a high risk setting?
Yes, so when we look at that level associated with those high-risk LGAs and international travellers, there's that requirement for 7 days of quarantine, and as the Premier said, that is likely to be home quarantine if someone has a suitable premise and they can quarantine that, and everyone else in that house also quarantines with them between days 8 and 14, so they will not be able to enter a high-risk setting or a COVID management plan event, which would include the actions.
So COVID management plan events, any large-scale event like carols,
Absolutely, any event where there is a COVID management plan. Now, the majority of people, as the Premier said, this will apply to the LGA of Byron at this point in time, and also to international travellers. So a very small number of people that this particular requirement will apply to at this point.
Sorry, did you say they're not allowed in within the 14 days at all?
That's correct, not allowed in the 14 days unless they have a specific exemption to be able to enter a high-risk setting. And that's been the same approach that we've had throughout this period when we had the requirements in place, which have been our level 3 in the existing cross-border travel direction. And for instance, we have that in place with the Northern Territory at the moment for returning SA residents.
Just to clarify the question for the Premier, has SA Health received any updated modelling from the Adelaide University team specifically towards what happens in the
As part of that model, one of the assumptions is around the case numbers, and it is important as part of that we put the cases into that model to then be able to predict what impact that has on our health services, with public health and social measures as well. So there is no change in adaptation in that modelling at this point in time until we start seeing cases here in South Australia.
If there's no evidence of community transmission in LGA with vax rates of less than 8%, does that matter? Can they come in there because there is no community transmission?
That's correct, yes. So at the moment there's no restriction on travel from Queensland, Tasmania, Western Australia. And on Monday next week we'll be reviewing the Northern Territory situation as well before the 23rd, because at the moment there is community transmission obviously in the Katherine local government area, and that will need to be factored in. But I would like to point out we will be listing all of the local government areas on the SA Health website. There'll be a specific link so that anyone can look to see what those requirements are from the LGA that they're travelling from. And as the Premier did mention, we have sought quite in-depth information from the New South Wales and Victorian health authorities to be able to adjust some of that data. So we've used the Commonwealth data as the baseline, and then have also received additional information from the authorities so that we could then make sure that individuals travelling, for instance, from the Yarra area or from Randwick local government area could travel into South Australia without quarantine. It was well above 80%.
Just to clarify something on the modelling that you see. So it's the data estimated case numbers over a certain period of time. Was it based on 80% being a fixed vaccination rate over that period, or will vaccination keep increasing as it normally would over that period?
Yes, so it does need to be readjusted based on vaccination levels, and particularly then once we do hit that 80%, and we're still on track for that next week, when we hit that 80%, then it will need to be adjusted then moving forward, taking into account case numbers coming into the community. So it's a point in time, that's what modelling is, a point in time, and it does need to then have a number of different assumptions behind it and cases feeding into that model as well.
So it would be premature really to be saying that at 90% we'll be dropping restrictions?
I mean, we're certainly planning towards that, and I think we've been very open that we are planning towards that for 90%, but really we're just going to continue to look at the model once we have cases in. It will depend on the number of cases that we have, where those cases are located, and do they involve high-risk settings as well. So there's a number of assumptions that sit behind the model, and it is a really important tool to help us plan and predict, but of course it is an unknown period that we're about to enter.
There's a whole bunch of new ways or new processes, entry forms and new act orders for people entering South Australia. For people who have had essential goalposts or reports over the past 2 years different ways to enter the state, this is harder.
This is simplifying the process. So now it is one link that you go to, which is the entry check system that incorporates all jurisdictions travelling into South Australia, and it also includes exemptions as required. So it streamlines the process. It then enables people to be streamlined then into our health check app, which will be required for people to enter in their symptom checks and providing out valuable information around test sites, for instance. So it is important that we had a unified model and that everyone was able to apply through the same system. So this is now removing the SAPOL cross-border travel application form. Of course, if you're travelling this weekend to South Australia, you still need to use the SAPOL form, but from Tuesday next week it'll all be through one central point, and we're working very closely with SAPOL to make sure that we can work as a team in assessing the entry check applications.
Doc, are you ready? word on Tuesday. Obviously, with the greatest respect, SA Health has not particularly handled travel exemptions particularly well in the last few weeks. Are you expecting a surge, and are you ready for that surge on Tuesday?
Oh, we're definitely expecting a surge of travellers coming across. I think we absolutely know that people will be excited to travel back into South Australia, and of course people leaving South Australia to travel interstate and come back in. So we're expecting thousands of people will apply come 5 o'clock this afternoon. What we have put in place is a number of plans in conjunction with Department of Premier and Cabinet, who have built such a fantastic application system. We've been testing it over the past week so it can be ready for launch at 5 o'clock today. Streamlining the processes, providing automatic approvals will make it so much easy and simple for the population, and not having a secondary SAPOL application as well.
Can I ask the difference between a booster shot and a third dose, or is it one and the same?
Look, essentially they cross into the same space at this point in time. We know with many vaccine programs you need a third dose to provide that added layer of protection, and we've seen it with severely immunocompromised individuals as well, having that third dose 2 months after the second. We are now advocating for everyone who has had their second COVID vaccine more than 6 months ago to have a third dose. So essentially the same thing, Andrew, the booster dose and the third dose regime.
What about people who aren't very tech savvy, or there wouldn't be many of them without a phone, maybe elderly? Are there other ways for them? Is it physical proof of that certificate?
Yeah, so we've tried to make it as easy as possible by adding in proof of vaccination into the system as well. We have our South Australian COVID information line as well, which has been undergoing training in this new system, so they can provide out advice to the community as well. We know that some people will simply not be able to use the technology, and that's why we have contingency plans in place to make it as easy as possible.
What is that contingency plan for older people without a phone? How do they prove they've been vaccinated?
Yes, so what we have put in place is a number of steps in this. The first is with our COVID community response team that we've established, expanding from our Medi-Hotel, we have a number of administrative and nursing staff who are sitting in this team who can then help people in terms of their symptom checks, understanding what their requirements are here in South Australia. So we've pulled together a number of teams, SAPOL together, our COVID information line and our quarantine team, so we can provide out that information through a phone service to individuals, which has been very similar as to how we've been managing the SAPOL cross-border travel platform over the past 18 months, because of course that is quite a complex system as well, applying through that web page on the SAPOL website.
But sorry, just on the vax certificate, how will someone without a mobile phone or without a smartphone be able to prove they've been vaccinated?
Yes, so what is required with a vaccine is showing proof of vaccination upon arrival, upon request, and so having a printout from your GP or your doctor who's provided your vaccination is an acceptable form of proof, and there are verified forms as well that can be downloaded off the internet, and I know a number of GPs have been helping patients with that, and that's an easy way then to show proof of your vaccine status. Of course, as the Premier said, we are moving towards VaxCheck, which will launch next week, but for people who don't have access to smartphones and the internet, really it's going and having a discussion with your community GP and getting that physical copy of proof. I would like to also add as well, we've discussed around children and the requirements for children to be vaccinated. So with this new system, it does mean that children who are aged 12 years and 2 months and older will be required to be fully vaccinated to enter into South Australia. So we have focused on the adult space. This is a change in our current position, and we are working very closely with SAPOL around that direction being released today, so it's really clear for the community what those requirements are coming into South Australia.
Put simply, just really simply, for people who are confused and they're going to be heading to South Australia in the coming days, what should they do?
Head to the SA Health website. We've got some fantastic, really easy to read frequently asked questions that will be going live today. We'll have the LGAs there as well, listing the requirements, and then of course the entry check system is very easy to use, easy to follow instructions, and then of course it does give you those requirements automatically. So we expect this will be a welcomed package for the community, that they'll be able to see those requirements really easily.
Yes. I want to talk about the Deputy Premier.
Excuse me, Doctor.